Lord, we're grateful that you did not live a me-centered life, that we don't really understand, but you have taken us in and we're grateful. We pray that we might imitate you and live a life of love. Toward that end, would you bless our time, our thinking, not just so that we understand concepts, but so that we live a life that is worthy of our calling and pleasing to you. In Jesus' name, amen.
In Greek mythology, there was a young man named Narcissus. And Narcissus was the son of the river god and of a nymph. And he was very proud because he was extremely good looking, very interested in himself. And the people who loved him, he treated with disdain. And so the goddess Nemesis saw this pride in his behavior and lured him to a pool, like a pond where he could see his own reflection. And he loved himself so much that he could not stop staring at the reflection of himself in this pool so long that he was unable to leave, right? Because of the beauty of his own reflection. And he stayed there so long that he lost the will to live. And from this story in Greek mythology, we get the term narcissism. Narcissism, if you defined it, is extreme selfishness with a grandiose view of one's own talents and a craving for admiration. And it's characterized by a personality type. So self-centeredness actually becomes a person's personality when they are narcissistic. Recent studies have shown that narcissistic personality traits have risen just as fast as obesity rates from the 1980s until the present. People are becoming narcissistic more regularly.
So in our culture, we've been very aware of the rise in obesity, and we talk about all the problems that this causes in a life and in a culture. But a rise in narcissistic tendencies also creates all kinds of problems in a culture. And that includes political division, lack of unity and care in a community. And that's all happening right now.
One of the things that they've taken note of is that the degree of narcissistic traits have risen very high in women recently, where it was usually more of a male thing. And since the turn of the century, it's been rising, narcissistic traits have been rising in people more and more. There's one study that was done by the U.S. National Institute of Health that has, you would think, right, that if someone has a trait, the older they get, the more pronounced that trait would become. So people who start out with narcissistic traits would become more narcissistic, and older people would have those more than younger.
It's called lifetime prevalence.
Right.
Looking for the increase in this particular thing as time goes on.
But what they found is that narcissistic traits afflict almost 10% of people in their 20s and only 3% of people in their 60s. Older people have more formed personalities and are less influenced by social cultural pressures. And when they were young, those pressures didn't exist. Narcissism is, though, rated on a scale. So it's not like some people are complete narcissists and everybody else are altruists. Some people, most people display some sort of narcissistic personality trait. It's just that some people display them a lot. And so those people would be termed narcissists. But the trend should be concerning. The trend of increasing narcissistic traits in younger people. It demonstrates that we live in a me-centered culture. It's all about me. My life is about me. I'm here for me. And extreme selfishness in people is becoming extremely normal. We expect it. Wolfe called the 70s the me generation. And
He called it the Me Decade. He wrote that
the
in
Me
the
Decade,
New York
okay.
Times magazine. But very quickly, people took what he said and turned it into the Me generation.
right. And so Time magazine picked that up, and they called millennials the me generation. I'm a millennial, by the way. But we've been living in a me society for decades now. In a recent poll, 84% of Americans said that enjoying yourself is the highest goal in life. I would say that's the very definition of a me society, isn't it? And in a culture that puts self-enjoyment and pleasure as its highest goal, we're going to quickly see that a me society means a me-first society.
When I was growing up, it seems like a lot of movies had a hero character who sacrificed himself to rescue the world. In the 90s and early 2000s, something quite different was popular in the academy, the film academy. So the movies that were most critically acclaimed had a similar kind of message, and that was that self-realization is the only worthy human ambition. And that, by the way, comes right out of a postmodern Michel Foucault mindset. So what happened in academia 50 years ago is what's happening in our country now, and that's the way it's always been. So in these movies, anything that gets in the way of discovering yourself, self-realization, whether it's rules or cultural mores or marriage covenants, is expendable. It must be eliminated so that you can become yourself.
Those are the heroes, the people who live for themselves.
Yeah. So that's one evidence that we're living in a me society. Another one is the abortion rate. The abortion rate says, no, this is not what I want. It's my body, my choice, my rules, it's about me. Divorce rates, from the year I was born until the year I went to college, the divorce rate more than doubled in the United States. More than doubled in just that short span of time. Credit card debt has soared in a way that didn't exist when Karen and I were getting married. When Karen and I were getting married, we hadn't gotten married yet. We went to a furniture store, and the salesman there tried to get us to buy everything we were going to need for life on credit. And I still remember what he said. He said, in your parents' generation, people had to just get by with junky stuff until they could have enough money, but we don't need to do that anymore. You can have everything you want right now. That's a me society temptation. The me society has...
Just a second. I think we look at our society and we think we have a commitment problem. You know, people don't want to commit to having children. People don't want to commit to their marriage. Workplaces are having trouble keeping their employees. I don't think we have a commitment problem in America. We always fulfill our commitment to ourselves, right? That's the description of what a me society looks like. We always are going to put ourselves ahead of, children, marriages, work, things like that. We can see where we're going as a society.
Me society has certain catchphrases, so they become popular. This is how we think, and so it's how we talk. What's in it for me? That's a me society catchphrase. What do I get out of it? Be yourself. I'm going to do what's best for me or for my family. Remember the old Burger King slogan, have it your way, have it your way. At Burger King, obey your thirst, the Sprite slogan. What could be more ridiculous than that? Obey your thirst. Kevin, we were talking about this. Kevin added, put your oxygen mask on first in case of an emergency.
And then you can help others.
I don't know, can you think of any other slogans like that that are just, out there that say, it's about me? Look out for number one. The kids will be fine. They'll be all right. Live your truth. Wow.
Yeah. So, what do you think? What do you think Jesus would have to say to our me society? Any ideas? What words from Jesus come to mind when we're talking about people being me-centered? Jesus says, it's about me, all right? That's true. Yeah. Rob? Yeah, whoever wants to be first must be last. The last shall be first. Well, I didn't get that, but okay. So I thought this verse especially speaks to our culture, and maybe that's why we don't quote it very often. But this is Luke chapter 9, verse 23. Jesus says, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross daily, and follow me."
Would you read that one more time, please?
Yeah, sure. "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me." The me-centered life cannot be the life of a disciple. Those two don't go together.
Becoming a disciple will inevitably take someone out of the me-centered life. If they remain disciples of Jesus, now you are my disciples indeed, they will come out of a me-centered life.
And when Jesus talks about denying yourself, he's not, it's funny how we think in America. We hear the word deny yourself, and that means don't eat so many cookies, right? But we're still doing that so that we can fit into a smaller size and look better, right? It still has a me sort of, and I'm not saying that's bad, but I'm saying that's not what Jesus is talking about when he says to deny yourself. He's talking about denying a life that's all about selfish gain and a self-centered goals and achievements that we're looking after. Our life, my life, is bigger than me. It's about Jesus, right? And about his plans for the world. To deny oneself, though, is not to reject oneself. I think sometimes people take it so far, they think, Jesus is saying that, you need to treat yourself like trash.
We have to hate ourselves.
We have to hate ourselves.
Really be against ourselves.
God does not reject us. And the life of self-denial that Jesus is talking about is not a life of joyless labor and, a life empty of enjoyment, but it's a life that's lived for others and especially lived for God, which we all know is actually more fulfilling.
And let me break in here for just a moment. Harvard University began a study in 1938 and is still continuing the study. They took 700 and some of their students, all males, and they followed them in this happiness study, and they've done it now for 85 years. 85? Yeah, 85 years this year. And there's still some people who are alive, and they are interviewing them, they're interviewing their spouses, and they're trying to find out what makes a life good. So here's the interesting thing. Some of the people who entered Harvard entered at the top of the social ladder. They were people who came from moneyed families, from historic families, and there were other people who entered Harvard because they had great brains and they got in without any money, and so they look at that and say, did that make a difference? And their answer was absolutely not. It made no difference. They looked at people, their intellect, and on, trying to find out what makes people happy. They looked at people and their suffering, people who had money, people who didn't have money, people who lost lots of money, people who gained lots of money. And over 85 years of studying this is what they found. The people whose lives are most fulfilled, most rich, are people who have a web of meaningful relationships. Has nothing to do with how much money they make, what a big impact they've had on society. It has everything to do with their relationships. That does not sell in our culture. That doesn't sell at Harvard University, where you have to be somebody and make your place in society, and yet that's the reality. Richness of life comes from relationships, and especially from our relationship with God. And the church is supposed to live in that way.
Americans are extremely individualistic. And in some ways, that's not a bad thing. The Bible doesn't speak against the value of the individual person. I think the Bible actually promotes the value and elevates the value of individuals, especially the value of slaves and of women and of children and the poor, who had traditionally been overlooked in the society when the Bible was written. Every person, male or female, according to the Bible, has been created in the image of God. Every individual has value. Their life has meaning in and of itself. And that was quite a difference from the surrounding cultures, where the king and the lords, the people up high, were the ones who had value, and everyone else was there to support them. Even the slaves and the individuals there thought, my life is not worth as much as a king's life. But the individualistic mindset of our culture, my life is about me kind of mindset, is more about deifying the self than it is about valuing individuals. We kind of don't see this sometimes. This is actually about making myself God rather than saying that individual people are important to God and have value in and of themselves. In a me-centered culture, the value of the individual actually diminishes, and individual people are often left by the wayside. You can see that in our culture. People who grow old and they can't do things, right? They get left by the wayside in our society. Isaiah says of humanity, each has turned aside to their own way. We have each run after selfish ambition and personal happiness, and the result has been a devastating loneliness and this nagging feeling, and even people who are very important in society, this nagging feeling that I'm the only one who really cares about me. It's sad. That's what happens in a me-centered society.
And that is epidemic among young people.
He said epidemic among young people. Trevin Wax, who writes for the Gospel Coalition, wrote a series of articles on what he calls expressive individualism. This is what he says. In this type of society, isolation and loneliness become more common, in part because people resist relationships that include obligations that may infringe upon their understanding of personal freedom and autonomy. People, they see relationships as getting in the way of them achieving or getting what they want, and so they're willing to put those aside. Think of a father who, when his kids are growing up, doesn't pay his kids any attention. He has his own life. He's got his own stuff to do. His kids are just getting in the way. Is he going to have a good relationships when he's older with his children? No, it doesn't work that way. So our society has resisted those type of relationships. He says, when the purpose of life is reconceived around finding one's deepest self and expressing it to the world, as opposed to whatever constraints your family, church, society, or politics may put on you, then all of our most significant relationships become recast in light of personal self-development. So he explains what this looks like. In marriage is about your soulmate, completing you, making you happy as you pursue to become the best version of yourself.
By the way, you will hear that kind of thing in the media. This is what marriage is about. And from my many years of marrying people, I can almost guarantee that marriage will not succeed.
It's no wonder people are getting married much less frequently nowadays, because people aren't finding their soulmates. Or they get married and they realize this person isn't completing me. They're more about themselves, right? And I need someone who fits me, right? And so if marriage stifles your pursuit of becoming who you want to be or feeling the way you want to feel, you not only have the right, but the obligation to break it off. That is the message that's coming through in our culture. Friendships in our culture have become an avenue to self-fulfillment, where it's easy to take on new friendships and to leave old friendships based on their success of offering me personal benefits. Doesn't it make sense that internet friendships have become the way we do things? Internet friendships have no obligations. You can block somebody if you don't want to be their friend anymore, and they can block you, right? They're easier. They don't ask anything of us. Churches have become dispensers of religious goods and services, where congregants imagine themselves as consumers and expect the church's teachings and their activities to better their way of life. Church even has become about me, right? And a me-centered society. I said before, 84% of Americans say that enjoying yourself is the highest goal in life. 66% of church-going Christians say the same. Think how different that is from the famous line of the Westminster Confession, that the chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. That our life is not about enjoying ourselves. It's about glorifying God and enjoying Him. Notice that one of the goals of life is still to enjoy. But it's not to enjoy ourselves, it's to enjoy God.
So how do you think the American church has been affected by this me-first mindset? We'll give you a moment here. Anybody have a thought about how has the milieu in which we live, the environment that we breathe in, affected the American church? Hang on for the microphone if you would, so that because we're recording this, other people will be able to hear.
I would say the lack of commitment to a church. If you're not happy there, then find happiness someplace else, a continual moving on of different churches.
Okay, a lot of turnover, yep. Yeah, when I first moved here, it was like a new thing for me. I'd been involved in a denomination in the past, and I moved here and found people moved in blocks, from this church to that church, from this church to that church, and it was just constant. And that was a new thing to me. Matthew?
I feel like the church has gotten more like selfish. Like people in the church gossip more, or are more judgmental of other people. I don't know if that fits, but that's what I've noticed, I think.
Okay, good. Sandy, right here.
I was going to say that as well. I think judgmental and very critical of everything. And if it doesn't fit in what I like,
Yeah, so that there's that sense the church should be what I want it to be, right? And so the criticalness comes out. Jim?
I don't see the volunteers anymore that used to be at church. We have to have paid staff to do this, that, and whatever. Back in the old days, all the people took turns teaching Sunday school because their kids were in Sunday school and everything. And it's like pulling teeth to get people to volunteer to work in a church. And why is it? Because it interferes with their life.
There was just a big study in American culture that The Week reported on recently that suggests that it's not just churches, but nonprofits across the board are having a terrible time recruiting volunteers. Jim?
Building on what Matthew said, as things get worse and worse, there are so many things to point fingers at that the Christian church can become finger pointers. And then that's what we become known as, which helps those people justify reasons for not being a part of us. So being a doctor that only finds symptoms and sees things that are wrong and not offering solutions. So as when we're done here, what we do as we walk out is more important than what we are able to talk about and see what are all the wrong things.
Good reminder.
I feel like another thing is like younger people are coming into the church because it interferes with like maybe their beliefs.
Talk a little louder, Matthew.
I feel like one thing like about the church that is like getting lower is like young people aren't coming in. Like people my age or a little older aren't coming in because I think it interferes with like their political beliefs or their beliefs with other things or just school, and they don't make time for it because they want to do other things in their life that they find more interesting.
Okay, good. One more.
Well, the church growth movement and the seeker movement, church movement, was to find ways of attracting people to become a part of a church according to their likes and what they would like to do and what kind of music they would like to have and what kind of things, and in many cases, providing entertainment for them. So on Sunday morning, they can have entertainment like they would on the late night show and everything else.
Okay. Let me give you a few others. One of the things that's happened just in my years of pastoring is that regular church attendance has changed. Regular church attendance used to be a regular church attender attended at least 3 times a month. Now regular church attendance can be a person who attends once a month. That's a really interesting transition that's happened. Tithing has gone down. Only about 5% of American churchgoers tithe. So 95% do not. And, you know, we can talk about the tithe some other time. I don't think tithing is per se a biblical concept. Cheryl just frowned at me. So I got to explain this very quickly. In the Old Testament, the tithes are tithes, not a tithe. And so in the Old Testament, an academic once figured out that an average Jewish person would give 29% of his income, not 10%. So that gets all mixed up because
Income didn't mean money, though.
That gets all mixed up because in our culture, we pay taxes for some of the things that their tithes were used for. And so it's not apples to apples trying to figure that out. The way to do it is do what St. Paul said. Each of you should decide in his own heart what to give. That's what we need to do. But it just as a fact, tithing has gone down to about 5% of churchgoers. Interestingly, about 77% of those 5% give way more than a tithe. Isn't that interesting? Sermons tend to focus on practical things and feel-good things. How do you become a more self-fulfilled person? And not so much on Christ and the story of God. So let me read something. I wrote a book called When Church Was a Family by Joseph Hellerman. Joseph Hellerman's a pastor and an academic out in California. And this line just caught me. He said, even God himself has now been recast in the role of a divine therapist who aids the individual Christian in his or her personal quest for spiritual enlightenment and self-discovery. And Jesus, in the final analysis, has become little more than a personal savior. That's a frightening thing.
So you read St. Paul, and we can see how strongly he speaks against this me-first mindset in the church. So this can't be a part of how we do things, right? One could argue that, I think, while the main subject of Paul's letters are always Christ, the objective that Paul has is to help people live an others-focused life, especially a Christ-focused life. So this is Philippians chapter 2. He says, "In humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others." Think if that verse got into our DNA, right? Into my DNA. If I was always looking to others' interests instead of only thinking about my own. He uses Timothy as an example of what this looks like, someone who looks to other people's interests. This is later in the chapter, in chapter 2, he says, "I have no one else like him who will show genuine concern for your welfare. For everyone looks out for their own interests, not those of Jesus Christ. But you know that Timothy has proved himself because as a son with his father, he's served with me in the work of the gospel." Notice that the interests of Jesus Christ are the welfare of his people. Timothy had Christ's interests in his mind, and so he took a genuine concern in the welfare of the church. Now, Paul tells, I like this verse. This is 1 Corinthians 10:24. Paul says, "No one should seek their own good, but the good of others." In the Greek, it actually says, let no one seek himself, but seek the things of the others. People are seeking themselves in our society. They want more for themselves. They want to become who they want to be. But Paul says, don't have that kind of mindset. Seek the good of others. Seek the things of others. In a me society, people who put others first will be seen as radical, different. Think of the impact that the early church had on Jerusalem when, this is Acts 4, no one claimed that any of their possessions were their own, but they shared everything they had. It changed the whole city. It changed the world, the way that they lived. Think of the impact our church could have when we commit to each other and we put each other's interests first, ahead of our own. Paul says something interesting in 1 Corinthians 9. He says, though I am free and I belong to no man, I make myself a slave to everyone. What a statement. I mean, that's almost mind-blowing. And yet, this was his attitude in life. This is what his life was for, to serve Christ and to serve others because of his love for Christ. And so, this sort of other-centered life can only come from a God-centered heart. Right? When God is first in our hearts, we're able to put other people ahead of ourselves. If not, it's not going to work. All right? When God becomes my everything, then I'm able to use my life for the good of others. One of my favorite verses is 2 Corinthians 5:15. "And he died for all, that those who live should no longer live for themselves, but live for him who died for them and was raised again."
So the others first mindset in the church is going to look different than the me first mindset in American culture, and that's a good thing. I mean, how do we get people's attention? We've tried having all the show, as Phil was talking about, and that doesn't last. How do you do it? Well, let's live the way the Bible tells us to live. So here's a few things. Respect is one issue. So a tenet of the me society is respect yourself. You got to respect yourself. You got to respect yourself. The Bible tells us to respect others. Honor one another above yourselves, Paul tells the Romans. Our society withholds respect until respect is given. I'm not going to give it to you if you don't give it to me. That's not the biblical way.
Isn't it, is this the same verse, outdo one another in showing honor? Is that right?
And sacrifice. So in a me society, we might tip our hats to Romans chapter 12, verse 1. Therefore, brothers, I urge you by the mercies of God to present your bodies as living sacrifices. But we won't offer our bodies. The unwillingness to sacrifice has huge ramifications. Kevin mentioned child rearing, for one. That requires sacrifice if it's going to be done well, as every parent knows. Not only that, but sacrifice is the way to spiritual wholeness. This is Psalm 50. At the end of Psalm 50, we read, "He who sacrifices thank offerings honors me and prepares the way so that I may show him the salvation of God." If we don't sacrifice, we miss out on that demonstration. Fellowship or partnership is part of the Christian life. Believers are members one of another. That's not something that the me society experiences, but we should experience it. Relationships. This is from Jesus' famous story about the rich farmer. The ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. He thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "This is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods, and I'll say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be required of you. Then who will get what you've prepared for yourself?" Did you notice the I will, my, I'll do this, me? It's just boom, 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 boom. One of the things you realize is that people who aren't rich toward God, as Jesus said, this is how it will be for anyone who stores up things for himself but's not rich toward God. People who don't have room for other people also don't have room for God. That's 1 John chapter 4, verses 20 and 21. All right, now let's kind of move into what we do with all of this, because Jim's right. If we just sit and say our culture's wrong, our culture's wrong, our culture's wrong, our culture's always been wrong. It was wrong 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago. And if all we can do is say, oh, they're wrong, they're wrong, they're wrong, and not show them something different, then we're not helping ourselves or sharing the good news of Jesus. I think if we're going to move from a me to an others mindset, we need to realize how hard this is. Our country has been individualistic, not since 1960. It's been individualistic before it was a nation. People came here, the early settlers were these strong, rugged individualists who left family and left identity groups. This is where my identity is, and they left all that to come here and start a new life of their own. And there's much to admire about that. But it was here that the me society formed. That is an important part of our political philosophy. The Bill of Rights came about in a markedly individualist society. So we're not saying, hey, everything about this is bad. Please don't understand us to be saying that. Our history of invention, which surpasses that of any other culture over the same period of years, grows out of that individualist, I'm outside the box, I'm not inside the box with everyone else kind of mindset. The individualist mindset that we have experienced is not the same in other places. So if you grew up in China, it would not be the same way. Or in India, or in West Africa, even in Europe. Our thinking is different. And what that means is that change will be difficult, because this is not something we just started. This is not something, like Kevin mentioned, that 10% of people in their 20s exhibit narcissistic tendencies. That doesn't mean they have narcissistic personality disorder. There's quite a difference. But exhibit these tendencies, and only 3% in their 60s. So we can say, oh, people our age, we didn't have that. We did. It has grown worse, but of course we have. That's part of our society. And change will be very difficult. Here's something we need to know. We'll never make that change if we don't feel secure. I can't do it if I start living my life for Christ and for others, that I'm not going to be okay. I won't be okay. I'll be ruined if I do this. I'm not going to do it. So we have to understand that God takes care of his people who live in his kingdom. We stake it all on God. This is a matter of faith to do this. And I think we need to redefine success. So we don't know it because we grew up in it. You know, does a fish know it's wet? No. Do we know that this definition of success is not the one that everyone in the world shares and that God shares? No, because it's just been our definition of success. And our definition of success is that I'm going to have enough money to do what I want, to live where I please for the rest of my life. That's not God's definition of success. And if we're going to change from a me mindset as part of the me generation to an others mindset where others are God and people, then we have to change what we think of as success.
I think too, it'd be easy to go away from this and think, okay, I need to think about others more than myself. But unless we make some serious changes to the way we live our lives, it's going to be very hard to do. We live in a me society where everything's set up that way. This is the way we've always gone. And so this might require some very creative changes to the way our life is set up. It might require a totally different kind of life than most people live.
That means a different schedule. So you start to get practical. My schedule needs to change. And so that schedule, which doesn't involve being with people right now, may need to involve being with people. Jim.
He says, judgment must begin with the house of God. So maybe what we should do is change the way we do church. We do church very individualized. I don't know if there's anybody's ever used the term sanctified narcissism, but that's kind of what we do a lot of times in church.
I think you just coined that.
Yeah, right. So somebody just asked this morning, so how's the fire shop going? The guy sitting next to you asked. And rather than answering, there was a guy who goes to it. I said, why don't you ask him? And he said, this is a different way of thinking, a different way of doing things. And I said, that's what we're trying to do. So to put in a shameless plug, on Thursday nights at 6:30 at the EB Center, guys are getting together and are learning that there is a place that I will be loved more when people actually know my flaws more than if they don't know my flaws. And when you stop and think about it, it makes sense. Because I can only love you as much as I know you. And guys are starting to realize that, you know what? These guys, we're on the same boat together, and they're liking it. So 6:30 EB Center, Thursday nights.
You know, we can cut that from the video if we want, but shameless plug maker. So we need to redefine success, and that definition has to include relationships. That's not how Americans have done it, but it should be how the church does it. And of course, that's going to make, how do I spend Thursday nights if I'm going to be this way? We're going to get practical and look at our calendar and see what we can do to make the transition not just easier, but possible. Okay, Jim said you'll become a better you if you'll do this. You'll sacrifice some things. You'll become a better version of yourself. Whoever wants to save his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake and for the gospel will save it. Yes.
And let's just end with this, one of the verses I like from Jeremiah, where he says, Lord, I know that a man's life is not his own. It's not for a man to direct his own steps. Our lives don't belong to us. They belong to God, right? And let's give him our lives, our future, and our present. Let's pray. God, this is difficult. We grow up thinking that life is about us. I guess it's natural to our sin nature. But Lord, I ask that you would teach us, guide us into humility and into valuing others above ourselves and to taking their interests in mind more than our own. Lord, would you help us to do this for your name's sake, to not live for ourselves, but for you who died for us and rose again. Pray these things in your name, Jesus. Amen.